Welcome, everyone, to the Responsible Bytes podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today I am joined by Dr. Klaudia Klonowska, who is a postdoctoral researcher at SciencePo. Welcome to the podcast, Klaudia.
Thank you, Zena.
Now, you wrote an article recently that really kind of captured my attention, and it's the reason I asked you to be on the podcast today. So we've seen in the recent kind of conflicts in the Middle East, there have been some illegal attacks on Iran on part of the US and Israel. And in response to those attacks, Iran has started to target data centers in the Gulf region belonging to the US. And this has kind of raised what I think is a really interesting discussion about whether or not these data centers are considered legitimate military targets. And this was actually the topic of the article that you wrote for Just Security. And for all of our listeners, I will put the link to that article in the description. But can we start maybe by talking about what is and isn't a military target under the laws of armed conflict, and then whether or not these data centers would fall under that classification?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, again, thank you so much for having me and for starting this conversation on data centers as military targets. Indeed, the events in the Middle East is what triggered this Just Security post, which I wrote with Professor Mike Schmidt. And it's really important, I think, for us, it was really important to write it because data centers indeed usually are not, I think, considered as potential targets. But the more you unpack it in the legal terms, the more you realize that there is actually something in there that could lead them to such classification. But to start maybe at the beginning, so what those attacks were, we're talking about kinetic attacks. So they were drone attacks on first two data centers in the United Arab Emirates. Those attacks, we know that they destroyed parts of the data centers, and then also another one that just followed in Bahrain. So they're estimated to be between the 1st and 2nd of March. The one in Bahrain wasn't targeting directly the data center, but the drone attack fell kind of close by. So we're not quite sure whether this was precisely the target, but it would appear so from the events, especially in this close proximity to the attacks in the United Arab Emirates. And as far as I know, these are the first times that data centers were physically attacked in any conflicts around the world, which is
The
quite
same
unique.
for me as well. Just quickly, I actually did a little bit of research and I personally could not find additional content or information or research on data centers having been attacked in previous conflicts.
Yeah, exactly. So neither could I. So it seems like this indeed could have been the first time that data centers were attacked in such a way, which is why I think it is a new question to be asked, because I think if you were to go back about 10 years when discussions around cyber were even more prominent than now, even if you talked about data and maybe data centers, you would think of cyber attacks, right? So you'd think of maybe attacking data centers to extract certain information, certain data from those centers, maybe to damage the data itself. And there are interesting questions around it. But in this case, we have a very different situation in which the whole data center is, or the whole or part of it is destroyed kinetically in a way that for a very long time disrupts its functioning and disrupts its use by both civilian and, if military uses it, by military actors as well. And so I also checked today, and the data centers in UAE and Bahrain still show that there's services disrupted, right? So I expect that with this kind of infrastructure, especially if there's physical damage to servers, it's not something that you can very easily replace, right? So it's going to take some time, and it's very different than if you had a cyber attack, right? That there are different considerations around it. So that's why the question comes, especially in this situation, like, okay, so was this lawful? Like, was what Iran is doing, are those attacks lawful? And I have to first make a disclaimer that this is actually really difficult to access in the current situation, because we have so little information about how data centers are used, by which partners, which militaries were using it. Like, even in the current situation, we don't know whether Iran targeted those data centers because the US is using them, because Israel is using them, or even UAE or Bahrain, right? So we don't really know enough to be able to assess specifically the lawfulness of these attacks. But there, at least what we can do is to try to analyze whether at any point such data centers would be military targets. And in order to do that, there's kind of like 3 steps of this analysis, right? That if I were to walk through like the legal analysis of whether this could be a lawful target, there would be 3 steps. So first, we would look at whether this is an object in general. And in this case, this is not difficult because this is not a cyber attack. It's not targeting data. It's targeting a physical object. This is an easy question to answer in this case. So it is an object. The second question would be whether it's a civilian object or a military objective. And in this case, it's an interesting. So in the law, we're going to talk about dual use objects probably in a moment, but in law, we only distinguish between civilian object and military objective, and it's either or, right? So a military objective then, and this is where this becomes kind of like a two-pronged analysis, is that on the one hand, it has to be by nature, purpose, or use, or location, used for military action. Even specifically, it should make an effective contribution to military action. So that's one, and I'll provide examples in a second to maybe explain it a bit more. And then the second kind of element of this analysis is that if it's destroyed, it partially or in whole, it should offer a definite military advantage, right? And so it is kind of a complex analysis whether something is a lawful military target or not, as you can see already from these 2 elements. And so to give examples, so whether something is by purpose or use an effective contribution to military action, so especially in the context of data centers, what I think is quite important is that you can't have a data center that, for example, long time ago was used to train military AI systems, right? That is not making a military contribution at the moment to the action. So you can't retrospectively target it, right? So we know that, for example, some of these data centers have been used, or not these specific, but Amazon data centers have been used, of course. We specifically look at hyperscale data centers, right, to train these kind of large language models. And so definitely there's an interest of governments and militaries probably as well to be able to get access to these kind of systems. And also you can have a situation in which a large language model was trained on these private companies, and then only after prolonged training it was given and acquired for use by military actors, right? But so that's really important that it can't be retrospective. It has to be something that's in current or future use. Data center has to support current use of the AI, or generally support data that is used by the military. So that's kind of the one side of it, and the other side about the definite military advantage is that you'd expect that this is kind of a low threshold, but you'd expect that if you destroy it, there is some kind of advantage to the party that's destroying it, right? So whether it disrupts the functionality, maybe, the fact that usually you want the computing power to be very close to the AI system that's in use. So if you destroy it and it forces the party to use data centers that are located further, which, for example, increases the time that it takes for data to be processed, could, for example, be a military advantage for the other party. So that's a bit more tricky to assess in the situation, but the threshold is low. So that being said, if those data centers in the UAE and Bahrain were used by military actors, for example, to support the use of AI decision support systems, or to store sensitive data that they were gathering from the field, it is possible that they were lawful targets. But with the current situation and the information we have at hand, it's really difficult to say.
It is really difficult to say. And I just want to touch on the second point that you were talking about, which is whether or not the centers were currently being used to support military AI. So I've done a little bit of research. I read in your article specifically talks about how there is no real clear evidence on whether or not these data centers were actively and currently being used for military AI. And I tried to do my own research and I came up with the same conclusion, that I could not definitively discern whether or not these data centers were in fact being currently used. So, from that perspective, I guess the question that I want to ask is around the requirement to actually document whether or not these centers are in fact being used for military AI. Is there any kind of requirement about documentation for different facilities or for different infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe to say just a little bit why so we don't have specific information about whether these data centers were used, but we do have information about, for example, the US or Israeli government using data centers more broadly. So maybe that's a good thing to say why it's maybe not a far-fetched speculation to ask that whether they were used, right? So for example, the United States is using Palantir Maven system for computer vision and target identification. And we know that Palantir's Maven system relies on Amazon cloud services. And the same has been also said of Cloud Code. So, Cloud Code has also been integrated into Palantir's system. And we've had that, right? We've had discussions about the recent dispute of Cloud Code with Anthropic with the US government. And we know that Cloud Code is also running on Amazon data centers, which is not surprising since they're integrated into Palantir's infrastructure. And there's more. Like if you look for it, there's lots of U.S. Government contracts with Amazon for the cloud service provision. This is kind of a speculation of where specifically data centers are used, but not whether they're used, right? And then we also see Israel, for example, and this is not specifically in relation to this current events, but about a year or two ago, there's also been reports of Israel using Microsoft's data centers to store intercepted Palestinian communications and to operate its own use of large language models as well. So it is worth saying that, this kind of cooperation between these companies and the governments and the military use of them is happening. But it is really difficult to say which one specifically is used. Now, whether states have an obligation to, identify it, or whether companies have to be transparent about it, that's not explicitly their obligation, right? And it's unsurprising that states also want to be, secretive about where they're storing the most sensitive or classified information, or where their systems are running, just because this is where, if they were to say it, this is where their vulnerabilities lie, right? So it's very difficult for them to, be open about it and say, this is it. Like, just hit me here, and I'm gonna lose, access to all of my AI data, my data, or all of my AI systems. So that's not their obligation. And same for companies. It's not, it's not their obligation to be transparent about that. We would expect and hope that companies can at least be transparent about who they're working with and the clients, but again, not their obligation, right? So, and another thing I think that we don't know about enough is also how much these kind of services are moved around. Like, we're talking about companies that have so many data centers all around the world. Even just in this region, I mean, 3 were hit, and that's not even the extent of data centers that's there. So
It's a
there's
very
also a
small
question.
margin.
Yeah. So there's also a question of how easily can they move the services from one, server to another, from one data center to another, that also may impede our knowledge of where things are stored in the moment.
Do you think the ubiquity of AI and data centers is actually contributing to the ambiguity?
Yeah, certainly so. It probably makes it more difficult to make such assessments with greater clarity that a certain
Which is
data
a
center is
strength,
used.
isn't it? Ambiguity is a strength within warfare.
Yeah, in this case, certainly so. I think that this ambiguity, and this is something that I've been pondering about, is that it's not only for us as analysts and trying to understand and discern what's happening, but I think that the same ambiguity may be happening for those that are attacking, which is, we've seen, for example, about a week ago that Iran designated a bunch of companies that are collaborating with the US as legitimate targets, which is not something that you can do because, as I said, you have to make such an assessment for specific object, right? So you would know if you're targeting this data center, that this data center is in use, not the whole company. So this is really important, because then what it makes me think is that they don't really know which data centers are used either. They can't be specific about it. So now all of a sudden they rely on these big corporations and their cooperation with the government to target. And similarly with those attacks on the 1st of March, what we saw is that the first reaction of Iran, or the comment that they gave, was that they were targeting to identify whether they were used by military intelligence, which is, again, not something that you do. You first identify whether they're used and then you target lawfully, not the other way around. But they might have been, also trying to see whether by destroying those data centers, they disrupt or in some way damage the military action. So I think that ambiguity is not only from the observer's perspective, but it might also be something that those militaries that are attacking are also struggling with.
I agree. And what's interesting is the point that you made earlier, and it's something you also touch on in your article about the dual use nature of these technologies. So, you're saying that Iran was attacking these data centers to discern basically whether or not they are in fact being used for military AI. But what we saw in the United Arab Emirates, at least, is that there was a huge civilian impact by targeting these data centers. So one of those impacts was people not being able to access their bank accounts anymore, or not being able to access any kind of online financing. And so what's interesting to me about the dual use nature of these technologies is that just because it's being used in a civilian capacity, it doesn't mean that it is not also being used in a military capacity. And I think you could argue that historically speaking, there was less grey in determining if something was or was not a legitimate military target, right? A hospital is a hospital, a school is a school, a military base is a military base. And here we have these data centers that are potentially being used for dual use. And so that kind of binary determination of whether or not it is or is not a military target is no longer as clear. So what are some of the implications that come with that? If a particular piece of infrastructure is used for both civil and military use, does it still then classify as a military target?
Yeah, this is a super important question, because it touches upon, like, why do we care about this, right? So we usually wouldn't care so much if military infrastructure is destroyed in conflict. And I'm not so sure whether I can make a comparison that it's been, easier, or that there were less dual use objects before in conflict. I'm not so sure, because of course you still see that, historically, a lot of times also in Ukraine, we saw that, there's certain interest, or there's certain benefit for the militaries to use these kind of facilities, although they shouldn't, but they offer this situation in which the other party might not be so certain whether it is used by the military or not. So, but that being said, indeed, with data, it's probably easier than when, to commingle this kind of civilian and military data and civilian and military uses of computing power than with physical objects, right? And it might be more difficult to also identify whether that's happening or not. And what's at stake, indeed, is that, we're increasingly relying on data for everything we do. I mean, you mentioned financial data, and that's something that in UAE was observed, indeed. Though I was quite surprised that I think the impact was not as widespread as I would have expected from such damage, because really, it's the kind of reliance on this. I mean, it's markets that are relying on it. It's financial, like private financial data. But it's also, it could be that healthcare providers are relying on it. Government services of, like, other than the military, could be relying on it for their operations as well. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine how widespread this could be if, for example, in this case, what I think is happening is that Amazon has a really extensive way of backing up data, of moving it quickly to another location, right? So although you also saw that they asked their own clients also to move and back up their data, right? So I
They
think it's,
did, yeah.
yeah. So I think they're trying to both do that and also ask clients to be able to, protect the data that they had. So that's what I mean, that I think that we haven't yet seen how extensive damage of data centers, how extensive effect it could have. And what we saw now is just, a tiny sense of what this could look like. So this is why it's important, because we don't want civilians to be affected by armed conflict. That's why in law we try to make sure to distinguish and to be able to separate civilian spaces from military spaces, civilian equipment from military equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's quite important to keep in mind, and that's why also, so unfortunately in law, the way that a data center, even if it's used by both civilian and military uses, and this is to your question, uh, if it is used by the military, a specific object like this, the data center nevertheless becomes a lawful target. It becomes a military objective. The only protection that it then gets is from the secondary, from rules that they're not secondary, but they're following rules from the identification of it as a military object or objective, is that you then determine whether you can target it based on proportionality and precautions. So you would have to make an assessment of whether directing your attack at this specific object and destroying, for example, disrupting military use of it would not be disproportionate to the disruption that you would do to the civilian uses or civilian harm. And the same with precautions. I think the interesting question there, and this is what also militaries would have to think about when targeting such data centers, is that there's kind of a question of whether it is at all possible, if such attacks are conducted kinetically, to distinguish which ones of the servers are used by the military and which ones by civilians. And if you were even able to distinguish which servers are used by the military, to be able to target them separately from the civilian servers. Now, when I was doing research for this article, I found out that when kinetic attacks are involved with the data centers, the big risk is the fire, which is what happened in the United Arab Emirates, is that one of the data centers that was attacked caught really large fire. And even though these data centers have, of course, special protections to be able to limit the extent of the fire spreading through the servers, there's nevertheless this risk that, this is going to explode and you're going to have a follow-on effect, even if you were just targeting this one data center with this one server, like that's kinetically, this is really unrealistic that you're going to be able to do that. But if it were possible, because of some reason you have a weapon that's specific enough and you have sufficient information, then you would have to do that this way so that you limit the effect for civilians. But again, this is where the law and the reality of this, I think, really become a bit more detached, because it's really unrealistic to see that such attack would take place in such a precise manner unless it was maybe done via cyber means rather than kinetic attack. So there's still a lot of questions around it, even if it's dual use, and I think it really complicates the assessment of whether such an attack could be lawful. But given just how much society relies on these data centers, it is likely that an attack that really damages such a center would disproportionately affect society and could be unlawful. So there's still ambiguity there as well.
Really interested in the proportionality conversation around harm to civilians. So traditionally speaking, when we talk about harm, we talk about physical harm, and harm doesn't just encompass physical harm. I understand that it does encompass other things. But traditionally speaking, it's been about physical harm. And when we talk about proportionality, we talk about it in that context, right? What I'm interested in is this idea of harm to civilians that is not physical, but does in fact impact their everyday lives. So, you kind of spoke about the data centers being physically attacked and the fires that they could cause, and that would cause physical harm to civilians. Absolutely. But even if they were attacked from a cyber perspective, that would still cause harm to civilians by impacting their day-to-day lives quite severely. Not being able to access your bank account is a huge impact on your life, especially in our growing cashless society, right? If I wasn't able to access my bank account, I couldn't buy food, I couldn't pay my mortgage, I couldn't, do all these things that would have a severe impact on my life. So then from that perspective, how do we encompass proportionality assessments that look at and consider these kinds of considerations outside of just physical harm?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially in relation to data centers, because indeed, when you're targeting a data center, you might not even expect humans to be in its vicinity. You might not even have humans on like the actual infrastructure there, or maybe just a few who are maintaining it. But you wouldn't what you're looking at is the secondary effects, right, of destroying a data center that would then also impact civilians. And in this case, they could, though, be physical in the sense that, for example, the maybe more likely example is the healthcare provision. So if you, for example, have hospitals that are relying on these kind of data centers to operate their machines or to provide data and information that they need for operations to their patients, there may be physical harm, right? Like this is the most, I think, clear example of whether and situation where physical harm occurs. But as you say, like also financial reliance on financial information. If you can't access it, you might also not be able to, for example, buy your medicine or move from one place to another that you need to go to. So the damage is quite extensive to civilian society. I think what's important is that we the understanding of what to consider in proportionality analysis is changing as the time goes, because indeed, most traditionally, it was very much about the physical harm in the very specific area in which the attack takes place, right? So the kind of secondary effects, or as we call them, reverberating effects, have only come into conversation in the last, decades, but they have not been there originally in the conversations. So I think that's, partly it's because we see more and more that warfare is so close to the urban environments that we cannot ignore the effects that it has on the civilians. So we're finding new ways to conceptualize it, but the extent to what kind of harm you have to consider in proportionality is still a disputed topic. And for example, one of this is also the psychological harm, right? So whether some scholars would say, you also have to consider these kind of long-term psychological effects. Others would disagree and say this is not something that you consider in proportionality analysis. And another element of it is also the forcibility. And this is also what would be difficult in the attack on a data center, is that the attackers need to only consider in the proportionality analysis the foreseeable civilian harm, right? So you don't need to be completely certain, but if you can foresee that, for example, that a certain financial service is relying on a data center, then you need to, then you need to be able to foresee what such a damage to the financial center would be and what the effects would be on the civilians. But we're talking here about situation where they hardly know whether the military uses the data centers, and they might hardly know what specific civilian uses of the data centers are there either, right? So they might not know what services rely on it, whether those services are backed up on another data center to prevent such disruption. What is the extent of it? So in such space of ambiguity where so much is unknown for the attacker, and it might be very difficult also to foresee what the effects are. And technically in this analysis, they only need to be able to take what is foreseeable into account. So I think that's also where maybe the protections become a bit more weakened.
So then going back to our ambiguity conversation, do you feel like the ambiguity here kind of creates a scapegoat for the ignorance argument of, well, we did think about proportionality considerations when determining this particular attack, but because we are not aware of all of these things about data centers, because we are not aware of how they're used or what infrastructure they're actually linked to, that is the reason why we still carried out this attack. Like, do you feel like that ambiguity argument does create a scapegoat?
I mean, in the first instance, it's very difficult in the current situation to expect that we would get to a situation in which these attacks are actually argued in court and assessed in this manner, right? Like in a very systematic manner. So that's the first and biggest hurdle. But if they were, such attacks cannot be conducted blindly. So it is not that, the ambiguity, if there's ambiguity, that does not allow such states to just target it based on suspicion. There must be more than that. Like they need to have some form of credible information that what they're attacking is actually used by the military. So any attacks by Iran that are, targeting a company like in revenge for cooperation with the US without credible information about the data center and how it's used would be unlawful. So that's not sufficient. Blind attacks should not happen. And then even then, when we were talking about proportionality and precautions, you should also expect from states that they take certain measures to try to find out, for example, its uses by the civilian population. And the as long as they do that, as long as they try to extensively find out how such attack would affect the civilian population, like then you'd expect that they might have still fulfilled their obligations. So there is ambiguity. I'm probably I think that the law is still quite robust in the sense that we wouldn't expect attacks that are, again, conducted blindly to be lawful. That's definitely not the case, and we would expect that certain precautions are taken. But nevertheless, it is definitely a challenge that both for the attackers and for those assessing it afterwards, that how do we know what's happening in this space where so much is unknown, who uses what the effects are, and what the attacker knew as well. Like that's unfortunately not something with such lack of transparency at the moment, it's not something that we can assess.
So, the recent kind of geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, for me personally, has lowered my confidence in international law and the law of armed conflict. So, you and I are talking now about the legitimacy of data centers as military targets, and we're talking about things like proportionality, and we're talking about proper assessments of military targets. But the reality of the conflicts that we're seeing don't seem to align with all of the things that we're talking about. And so in the context of this whole argument of whether or not they are or are not military targets, where do you think that sits in the broader kind of landscape of the actual value of the law of armed conflict and international law in the context of the current geopolitical climate?
Yeah, that's a big question to
It
to
is,
ask.
I'm sorry, and it's a pessimistic question, I'll own that, I will. But,
No,
the
yeah.
last few years, we really have seen a lot of we've seen conduct within the conflict of the last few years that has not been in line with international law and with the laws of armed conflict, and we've seen no repercussions for that. And that's the biggest point for me, really, because you were talking before about actually being prosecuted about these things, and that's when these laws come into play and when we have arguments in defense of actions and decisions that were made. But we're never really getting to that point. And so it feels like these actions and these decisions are just being made, and it's kind of the international law and the law of armed conflict is just there, but it doesn't do anything. And I think that's kind of where my pessimism is coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a sense that I think the whole field is getting. So, um, you know, we're definitely seeing a crisis of international law in this geopolitical space right now, where actors that we have even historically expected from them to uphold and to at least speak in the language of international law when they're conducting attacks are also dropping this form of upholding international law. It's a very fragile environment because international law is not the same as domestic law. It doesn't have such robust institutions to be able to support it, and it all depends on the willingness of states. It depends on this kind of sometimes written, sometimes even unwritten agreement between states that this is how we fight wars. So the more this is abandoned, the more the language of international law is abandoned. It unfortunately creates a space that is quite vulnerable for civilians and for the protections that we have created. So it is the whole field. I mean, as I see among international lawyers, you in this space, you could question, like, is it even worth asking these kind of legal questions if those that are fighting it don't care? Like, they might not
Yeah.
care about whether or not this is a military target. They're just gonna do what they wish. um I still think that it's important work to be done, because this is history of so many decades of work that we we rely on. Like, I really, in this space, what I usually like to think about is just how much effort it took so many people to convince states and those individuals that were heads of states in the moment that this is worth agreeing on, that there are some rules that we need to limit this war. And even those rules are sometimes very, they might be weak. Sometimes we're not, convinced, and sometimes we're not satisfied by those rules. Nevertheless, this is a huge achievement. We're talking about centuries of wars that just completely disregarded any rules, and we didn't know anything what to expect from such conflict. So I think that it's really important for us to reiterate it. And sometimes, when we do see changes in countries, and when we have at least this kind of bottom up pressure on governments, that this is something we're fighting for, like these are values that we really want to stand by, then hopefully at some point, by that pressure, you could expect that governments, rather than looking towards courts, which we're not going to see soon, like look towards societal movements that really inflict pressure on their governments to fight by the rules and to um, uh, obey by the values that they really worked for so many years to develop.
Do you feel like AI-enabled weapon systems or AI-enabled military systems will change or influence the laws of armed conflict as they currently stand?
If the use of AI would change the laws of armed conflict, yes. In many ways, it happens in this space of interpretation. So they don't necessarily change the rules, as in we're not seeing new rules being made or old rules being dropped. That's not what's happening, but more that because rules and legal norms are all about interpretation of terms. So I think a good example is what we talked about in relation to proportionality, right? So what kind of harm is included often has to do with what capabilities we have to find out about harm, right? When we didn't have satellite information, when we didn't have AI-enabled intelligence systems, like our understanding of what harm to civilians is caused from certain attacks was very limited. But the more militaries are, uh, you know, um, employing these kind of capabilities, their ability to estimate that harm is growing, and therefore also our understanding of what needs to be considered, what is foreseeable, is changing. And so that's where you could see that a rule doesn't necessarily stretch, but it's what it encompasses stretches because of the capabilities. And I think that's the best example of how norms can be affected by new technologies.
I know I've thrown two very big questions at you, so I'm going to ask you the last question, which is the question that I ask all my guests, which is a much smaller question than the two big ones I just threw at you. And it is, what is one piece of advice that you have for people for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So what is your one responsible bite?
I want to end this conversation highlighting what also states have to do to prevent these kind of attacks on data centers, because I think that within the context of this conversation on data center, what's also important is that we talked all about what the attackers do in assessing whether a data center is a military objective or not. But I think it's really important that we expect from our countries to actually not use data centers that are used by civilians for military uses. And this is what I think needs to be the conversation now: is it for the states that we represent, that we're part of? Do we want our states to engage in such activities? And I would say it's really important that we pressure them not to. So you could see maybe data centers being created specifically for the military somewhere else, or maybe for them, using some modular centers, being able to separate it in the way that if a data center is suspected of military use and it's attacked, it wouldn't affect the civilian population. Unfortunately, the extent of harm that can be done by attacking a data center that is relied on by the civilian population can be quite extensive. So I really think that the conversation now should be about, how to make sure that we don't allow that our states really are responsible in separating such uses and not putting their military AI systems and reliance on them on the same data centers where the civilian population is storing their services or data.
I think that's a wonderful note to end this episode on. Klaudia, you've been wonderful to talk to. I loved reading your article. I found it so informative. And again, for our listeners, I will link it in the description. It's a reason why I asked you to be on the podcast today, and you were even more informative in our chat today. So thank you so much. I really do appreciate you being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Zena. It's a pleasure to be on your Responsible Bites podcast, really. Thank you.